Hi, my name's Sasan Kisrabi with Proteus Debate Academy. I wanted to do a debate analysis video. The difficult part is finding a video to do. So I'm not going to watch 50 debates and then figure out like which ones are worth analyzing. So in the future, I'd love to hear from you, recommendations of rounds you were either in or you saw or you want broken down, or how I would vote or how I think other people will vote or what people did well. But it's really hard to know what's going to work, what's not going to work, what people care about, what people don't care about. So I just went on the PF Videos YouTube channel, picked the first one that had the actual video, and we're gonna just do an analysis of it. I'm gonna watch it. I'm gonna let you know what I think, what's good, what's not, and then maybe I'll know what I'm talking about. Maybe I won't. But one way to find out. All right, let's start this video. Oh, sorry. The resolution is the Saudi Arabia. The U.S. should end arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Topic.
Kate and I affirm, and our sole contention is bringing peace to the Middle East. Thrall Cato in 2018 writes that prospects for snapping up market share of the global arms industry have historically powered arms sales. Unfortunately, Thrall also finds that increased arms sales increases the chance of states starting militarized conflicts and decreases cooperative foreign policy behavior.
Okay, so no real top of case, going straight into the contention. Nothing wrong with that. Their AF on this is that it increases the odds of them starting military conflict, them having arms, and that's pretty straightforward, and I'd argue probably true, but it's also really predictable, right? So if I was the neg, I would have block after block to this. I'm gonna go get something to drink real quick. Fill this with some water or something. Energy's feeling a little low, not gonna lie. So it's gonna be a slog if I don't have energy to get through this. So give me a second. Okay, real talk, if I'm being honest about probably why I got up and was like, oh man, maybe I should get some water, is I'm trying to figure out how to say this without hurting the feelings of children. I'm already bored by this speech, and that's important because to me the two most important rules to try to follow while you're debating, maybe not the two most important, but the two easiest to keep in the forefront of your mind, are 1, don't be boring, 2, cowardice is a voting issue. And we'll probably make 2-Minute Tuesday videos talking about both of those concepts, but suffice it to say that from the first couple sentences of this speech, I can tell that this is going to be a boring speech. I can tell that the impacts aren't going to be fleshed out in a way that are going to make me give a shit about anything happening to anyone. There's going to be some weird abstracts and saying lives saved, but I highly doubt that it's going to go into any sort of measurable or qualified or quantified, like we talk about in the impact video, analysis of what these issues actually mean for actual living human beings, because probably if it did, it would be it's gonna shift tones a lot to start like very understated and like states tend to go to war when they have weapons, and then at the end actually talk about like, hey, here's what it's fucking like to get bombed. But let's give, I'm not sure which side this is, boy with sweater. Let's give him a shot. Okay. Thoughts on the argument? I think the argument's fine. I think it's a little bit predictable. Let's see where he goes with it. Maybe the argument itself is a little more nuanced.
By affirming, we have the chance to reverse this trend. Ending arms sales to Saudi Arabia saves lives in 3 ways, and first is by cutting off Saudi.
I don't like when people make a sole contention and then have 3 subparts. Sounds like you have 3 contentions with 1 impact. And the fact that you have 3 contentions with 1 impact is probably bad for you, right? It should be a signal to you that your arguments aren't diversified properly. All you've done is give yourselves 3 things that you need to accomplish in order to reach your impacts, but then 1 thing for the opponent to take out. Now, maybe there are 3 separate ways they reach the same impact, but why would you want 3 separate arguments with the same utility, right? The impact doesn't get better. You don't, like, winning 2 of the 3 arguments isn't functionally better than winning 1 of the 3 arguments. So why do that to yourself? Just make 3 separate contentions and then give 3 separate impact scenarios, diversifying time frame or probability versus magnitude, or something that is more strategic than just saying we're going to talk about one thing but in 3 parts, which I don't find to be terribly effective.
Saudi Arabia's supply of deadly weapons. YFD Conversation writes in 2018 that because Saudi Arabia doesn't have an arms industry, it has purchased nearly $90 billion worth of weapons from the United States.
That's a pretty silly argument, I think. Like, because Saudi Arabia doesn't have an arms industry, it buys its weapons. Is like saying, because we don't have something, we import it. But Sure, but I think also the fact that we can import it easily and cheaply speaks to why we just choose to do that rather than make it ourselves. And in instances where the imports are expensive or difficult, we end up starting to make it ourselves. I'm sure there's a lot of economic precedence that says that once the supply of imports or whatever gets harder, people just make it themselves. I don't think there's very much... Probably some technological whatever barriers for them to be able to make their own weapons, but suffice it to say that that is the answer I would try to defend against, but let's see where this goes.
Furthermore, Haverly of the New York Times explains in 2018 that transforming the Saudi military to use the technology of other countries would cost a fortune, require years of retraining, and greatly reduce its military power for a generation to come because the military is currently set up to conform to U.S. standards.
The military is set up to conform to U.S. standards because it's U.S. engineers and U.S. operatives and people basically doing everything but pushing the button that kills people. So, like, yeah, you can't do that with some other country's technology, but I don't understand. Like, the U.S. is almost doing everything. What's to stop it being different with Russia almost doing everything? Now, these are some potential counter-arguments, but with that, at least where I would research for the blocks, right? But with that having been said, like, it's a pretty strong setup for an argument. It's establishing that first Saudi Arabia relies on an outside source, and that outside source is difficult to replace. Now, regardless of whether this is going to be easy to dispute or not, yeah, that's a solid start to the argument.
Crucially, Chatsky of the Council on Foreign Relations in 2010 explains that Saudi Arabia is completely dependent on the U.S. during the entire life cycle of every warplane sold in order to maintain and service them.
Same thing, right? Like, it's only as strong as your evidence saying someone else can't replace the U.S. But, you know, it's saying, like, my entire house, my car is entirely dependent on gasoline, which it is, but that's because I don't drive an electric car. It's not to say that, like, because I'm dependent on gasoline, I could never buy an electric car. I've just chosen not to do that because I don't make enough money.
In fact, Meyer of NPR writes in 2018 that if the U.S. cut off the sale of plane parts today, the Saudi Air Force would be grounded tomorrow.
Yeah.
Second is congressional oversight. The U.S. would most likely end its arms sales through an act of Congress under the Arms Export Control Act, or AECA.
Well, that didn't really work out, did it? As long as Trump has the power to override that and make executive orders. So.
Indeed, in October, Schwartz Politico reports that an arms sale could not pass the Senate or the House today, with lawmakers waiting for the next Trump administration-approved arms sale to reach Congress before they act. Thomas of the CRS in 2017 explains that current sales are not permissible under the AECA because Saudi Arabia consistently violates human rights.
I'm not sure what unless the AECA is some sort of mechanism you're using to stop this, I don't see what the relevance of it is, right? It's not permissible, and yet it's happening. So what part of the discussion, and is it a justification for ending the arms sales? Like, I guess, but I think the impacts of saying that you end them killing people would be the justification, right? I don't see why you need like legal justification for taking the action when you're going to have net beneficial impacts in the end anyway. But
an arms deal would set a precedent to do so in the future. Indeed, the CRS explains that in 1975, congressional action over President Ford's arms sales set a precedent that Congress can regulate arms sales more generally. Notably, per the CRS writes in 2018 that Congress has never blocked an arms sale under the AECA. This is crucial because Dorminio Cato explains in 2018 that the U.S. sells more weapons to riskier nations than safe nations, unchecked by Congress. Affirming sets a precedent of blocking arms sales to nations that violate human rights, meaning that in the future, we stop arms sales to more than just Saudi Arabia.
Okay, so what's happening here is he's trying to say we stop the arms sales in a particular way that doesn't apply to your block card saying we can't stop the arms sales because it's never been stopped this way, and the blockades don't work argument is predicated on something else. That's fine. I think the problem with saying that this has never happened so your arguments don't apply is that it's never happened so you don't have any precedence for any of your arguments either. In addition to that, what's happening is that they are trying to basically garner more offensive ground by saying that not only will this end, basically that there's extrinsic impacts. Not only does it end arms sales here, but it ends arms sales other places. The problem is that you're using fiat to say that the arms sales in Saudi Arabia will end. The arms sales, like basically the spillover, will only happen if the inherency is structural. I'm trying to not use as many terms as possible that we haven't talked about. Basically, in your case as the affirmative, you have to explain what the barrier to your action being taken is in the status quo. Why isn't it happening? And probably the barrier here is attitudinal, which is to say that people just don't want to. So it's a little difficult to say that doing this here with Saudi Arabia in this hypothetical example would spill over to us stopping other arms sales, because there's no evidence presented to indicate that we can't stop the arms sales because of some structural issue. It's just that we want to sell arms. So why would us deciding not to sell arms to Saudi Arabia inherently mean that we don't sell arms to other places? So this case will be a lot stronger by establishing some sort of structural inherency, and then the spillover might be easier to argue because you say this is the same structural inherency that's affecting other things, and by us overcoming it here, we can overcome it other places. At the point where the inherency is all attitudinal, in other words, we're selling arms to Saudi Arabia because we feel like it, but now let's talk about what if we didn't feel like it, it becomes hard to talk about other places because the negative can just say this debate's not about what if we didn't sell to other places. You can talk about other places if you can prove not selling to Saudi Arabia would mean not selling to other places, but that jump can't be a hypothetical what if scenario in the same way that the Saudi Arabia one is. It has to be naturally entailed and has to be given the motivations currently in the status quo. And that's what we call fiat, right? This will be overreaching fiat to say that in other instances the attitudinal inherency will be overcome, which is probably why attitudinal inherency is not all that strong, and you probably want to look for structural inherency. Because basically, as long as people don't feel like fixing a problem, one case, right, one action, one band-aid, probably isn't going to fix it. Your AF cases are going to be stronger by arguing that, like, no, we give a shit, we're trying, this thing is in the way, so let's remove this thing. And let's see how the rest of this case goes.
Third is using arms as a punishment to reduce conflict. Heyman of the Atlantic in 2018 explains that right now Saudi Arabia has little fear for the repercussions of their actions, emboldening them to commit human rights abuses. Thus, Caverly of the New York Times in 2018 finds that if American officials really want to encourage a change in Saudi Arabian policy, they need to take away Saudi weapons. Brinley of NBC thus concludes.
So this is a terrible argument. It's not uncommon, but I think it's a terrible argument. How does the logic work? The logic is this. Saudi Arabia is conducting a military campaign and killing a lot of people. And it also has a lot of human rights abuses. Okay. The United States could stop its ability to do that and at least take away the weapons, right? And they say, we won't give you your weapons back until you stop committing human rights offenses. Great. Your argument only has solvency if Saudi Arabia decides to conform to what the United States is saying, right? So what happens after it conforms? The United States gives them weapons, right? So, one, how are you affirming the resolution? It's a temporary end of sale, right? Why would Saudi Arabia be persuaded to change what they're doing if they don't believe the United States will ever give them weapons again? They probably wouldn't. So you're either saying this is temporary, contingent on them doing something, in which case you're not really affirming the resolution, which is a problem, or you're saying that, we'll get them to behave differently and then they will just not want the weapons anymore and then we'll build a relationship on something else, which, how does that argument really work? So the logic there is pretty strained. I don't know if the neg's going to talk about this, but I would be pretty upset about this as the negative.
In 2018, that the best way to...
Especially because that should be negative ground, right? That should be ground for a counterplan. We don't end the arms sales. We, put a pause on them, or we end some of them, or we use the arms sales as a bargaining chip, right? Like, that's certainly a negative argument. Use the promise of the arms to motivate Saudi actions should be negative ground. The affirmative shouldn't be able to leverage the promise of selling weapons and a topic that says end arms sales.
Force the Saudis to change their ways is to stop sending them weapons. The impact is stopping Yemen. In total, Ensor of the Telegraph writes that 60,000 people in Yemen have been killed through military conflict. In one especially...
60,000... Okay, we'll go on. But yes, this is not that strong an impact to go to because you're skipping the middle step, right? There's the step of Saudi Arabia has the weapons and then Saudi Arabia is killing Yemeni people, which, yes, you would think it would be difficult to kill them without the weapons, but as long as it's like means mode of opportunity, right? In terms of the classical way that movie detectives find murderers or whatever. So there's means motive opportunity. Saudi Arabia has the means motive opportunity to kill Yemen, and the only thing the weapons would take away is the means, right? But they would still, no one's going to stop them from attacking Yemen when they're able to. You're not changing their motivation in wanting to attack Yemen. So all you're doing is taking away one mean. And it's pretty easy to replace means, especially since people have been killing each other for a really long time and they haven't been using sophisticated military technology to do it up until pretty recently. So if I was a negative, I'd talk about that.
Horrifying instance, Borger of The Guardian 2018 reports that the United States supplied the bomb that Saudi Arabia used to kill 40 children on a Yemen school bus.
This is also pretty bad impact presentation. You're raising your voice slightly to say 60,000 people and 40 children on a school bus isn't really explaining that, these are human lives and they matter and let's put them in comparison to something else. 60,000 people is 20 9/11s. 60,000 people is more people that have died in every U.S. conflict since World War II. 60,000 people is how many people we lost in military conflicts and terrorist attacks of the last 20 years multiplied by 10. Put it into perspective, right? Give it some sense of weight other than right now really you're just saying lives lost and then putting a number on it, which is not really going to help us compare it to other issues. Sure, you have 60,000 and probably the other side isn't going to argue that by selling weapons we save more than 60,000 children, but it becomes really hard to compare that 60,000 number to other sorts of impacts, right? Where it's like the economy or other sorts of impacts. I don't know, environment. I don't know like how to compare 60,000 deaths to other things, and I'm guessing that it's gonna be compared to other things, and this is where you want to set up that framing mechanism you want me to use later when they come up and they say the economy. I want to already feel like no, we're talking about massive disasters here, instead of like, well, the economy sure seems important, how do I compare the two? Let's see.
U.S. weapons sales are also contributing to the famine in Yemen. Monday of LSE in 2018 finds that Saudi Arabia uses airstrikes to destroy food production and distribution centers in Yemen and limit imports of food that Yemenis need. The UN in 2018 warns that as a result of these food shortages, 12 to 13 million civilians are at risk of starvation. Ceasing arms sales would prevent these strikes. To save innocent lives, vote pro.
Yeah, okay, so that's a pretty big impact, 12 to 13 million people potentially dying. It just really doesn't have much of a solvency argument. So this is a negative impact, not a negation impact, but negative in the sense of like it isn't something happening, it's the lack of something happening. In formal logic, it's a fallacy, which probably make a video about, called denying the antecedent, which says A leads to B, not A, therefore not B, which sounds like a solid argument. So the example I learned this with was Dexter, not the kid with the lab, but the serial killer. It says, if Dexter forgets to clean the crime scene, he will get caught. Dexter did not forget to clean the crime scene, therefore, Dexter will not get caught. And at first glance, you're like, yeah, that makes sense, which is why this logical fallacy is very pervasive. But the fact of the matter is that there's a million other ways Dexter can get caught. There could be witnesses, he could confess, he could DNA match, he could whatever, right? So that argument only works if the only way, it's like, so if and only if Dexter forgets to clean the crime scene, he will get caught. Then you can say, yeah, not A, therefore B. But unless you can prove that, and that takes a lot of evidence, or even just one person saying it, right? But the burden of proof on it is high. There's a million other ways these people are still going to probably starve to death, right? Like you're saying 13 million people are starving right now. Saudi Arabia stops bombing the food places, and now overnight there's enough food to feed 13 million people. Like, how long does it take for that food to come out? How long does it take to starve to death? Like, will the food production be able to come up in time? And Saudi Arabia has no other methods of stopping the food production. Did the Ukrainian Holodomor happen through airstrikes? Did the North Korean famine happen through airstrikes? Those were all state-enforced famines. So probably not that solid an argument. So all in all, my impression of this AF case is that it puts a lot of eggs into certain baskets that it just doesn't have the evidentiary support to really back up. A lot of it's conjecture. A lot of it's like, well, this is leading to this, we stop doing it, so then the result never happens again, right? Probably a weak position to be in. Now, we'll see what the affirmative, what the negative does with this. But all in all, I would say that this is in terms of the case itself, I'd give it like a C. Like, it's passing, but it's really not doing very much in terms of strategy. It has one contention split into 3 subparts and one impact just about Yemen. And it's painting a very easy target for the opponents. In terms of the cards and analysis, nothing is really hyper nuanced or specific. Seems pretty generic and like the other side should have blocks. As far as the delivery goes, it just seems inexperienced. It seems like you're not. I shouldn't count on you to really expand on your impacts. And let's see what our opponents have to offer.
Everyone ready? Okay. Rich RW negates resolve. The United States shall halt all arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Contention 1 concerns geopolitics. Subpoint A is about jelly donuts.
Okay. Okay.
Juno 18 of MEPC finds that contrary to popular belief, U.S. power in the Middle East is actually increasing. As our allies in the region get stronger and stronger, Reuters 18 indicates that at the center of all of these alliances is the region's leader, Saudi Arabia, who acts as the linchpin for America's strategy in the Middle East. Hannigan 18 of Time magazine indicates that the U.S.-Saudi Arabian relationship is built upon one fundamental premise. Saudi Arabia lends their support to America as long as the United States provides them with firepower and protection. If arms sales end, however, the alliance will crumble as America fails to accomplish its end of the deal.
This is presuming that anything in the Middle East is going well, right? Like, yes, you're right. The U.S.-Saudi Arabia relationship is probably a major driving force within all of the things happening in the Middle East. Probably also the U.S.-Israel relationship. But what, like, you're going for status quo solves in the Middle East? Like, famously the place with the most, like, geopolitical unrest? Like, and yeah, I don't know if status quo solves the Middle East is the route you want to go here. But let's see what the evidence says.
Tragically, the National Interest 18 indicates that if America loses its domination over the Middle East, the region would spiral into a free-for-all as foreign powers try and fill the power vacuum that America has left behind.
What foreign powers, how, when, why? Russia, China, UK, France? Why doesn't the UN stop them? Like, what does that scenario look like? You're giving me the DA. This should be a, like, foreign powers come in argument, right? So how is the US the barrier to that? Who wants to go in? Give me all of that information other than to just say, like, they will go in, because I could just as easily say, no, they won't.
Beaumont 18 of The Guardian implicates that this will amplify conflicts as nations all compete for domination of the Middle East.
Why? For oil? Like, the quickest diminishing in value commodity in the world? For, like, it's not like it's the South China Sea, right? It's not like a significant trading route. Like, what is the thing that they're going to fight over? People in the region are going to fight each other, certainly, but they're already fighting each other. Who is going to go in and why? I need to know that. I'm not saying that no one ever would, but as far as your case goes, and me being tab or whatever, like, what is the argument here?
Subpoint B, offshore balancing. The CSIS indicates that currently the United States is utilizing the strong Saudi Arabia in order to counter Iranian influence in the region. In order to achieve this objective, Weseman 18 of SPRI explains that the United States has used arms sales to strengthen Saudi Arabia. However, if you end arms sales, the perception of Saudi Arabia as a strong ally against Iran will collapse, and America will be forced to deal with Iran on its own.
What? Okay, what? Stop Iran from what? And what is Saudi Arabia doing? It's creating the perception that we have an ally. We do. We have, like, the only thing the U.S. would need to combat Iran is military bases. And we have those with or without Saudi Arabia. And you at least need to read an argument that says arms sales would get rid of the military bases, which certainly needs evidence. but like, what's the perception that we're friends with Saudi Arabia is stopping Iran from doing something, some imaginary thing? But if we were not friends with Saudi Arabia, Iran would now be emboldened to do that thing, and the U.S. wouldn't be able to stop them? Like, what is... That's a lot of blank variables, and I'm not really understanding what scenario you're painting here.
This perception will ultimately be backed by reality, as Tufts University finds that due to a high dependency on the United States, the halting of all arms sales will cripple Saudi America's military for at least a decade.
Saudi Arabia's military for a decade? Okay, so it makes Iran want to attack Saudi Arabia? Maybe? Is that where you're going with this?
Tragically, the Atlantic 17 finds that if America was forced to increase aggression against Iran, it would be very easy for confrontations and small escalations to spiral out of control and lead to all-out war, which could kill millions.
What? I don't understand. Is the U.S. military is either acting as a deterrent or it isn't, right? So, in other words, either Iran right now is thinking, we don't want to go to war with the U.S., so we won't do this, or they're not. If they are thinking we don't want to go to war with the United States, then why would they, post arms sales, decide, yeah, let's go to war with the United States? I'm not following that. Because you're saying right now Iran doesn't want to go to war with the United States. So if we stop helping Saudi Arabia, it'll decide to go to war with the United States. I need way more there.
Indeed, U.S. news indicates that there is absolutely zero communication between Iran and America, making the chance that a small...
What? There is absolutely zero communication between the U.S. and America?
Miscalculation sparking into conflict very, very probable.
Does the U.S. news say that miscalc is probable, or did you just say that there isn't communication and thus miscalc is probable? Also, like, why is the current tension different? Like, why is us selling arms to their biggest competitor not more aggressive than us not selling arms to their biggest competitor? Miscalculation, first of all, is always possible, but secondly, is only more likely if they're ramping up to do more of something. You can say an arms race happens when the United States is fueling the Saudi Arabian military, because then Iran has to be stronger to maintain its hegemony, and then the mutual increase in military resources and stockpiles and whatever leads to a greater chance of miscalculation. But that's not what's happening here. Somehow Iran does something. Like, maybe I'm not terribly bright, but I'm just not following what signals to Iran that it should increase its... Also, like, miscalculate of what? Like, Iran doesn't have nukes. It's trying to, but you're going to argue that they're going to gain nukes faster by the U.S. stopping arms sales to Saudi Arabia? Like, why? That would presume they could try harder than they already are to get nukes, and that the motivation would be to nuke Saudi Arabia, except now they don't, and now they want to use it against the U.S. Like, why? What? How does that work?
If the United States directly intervenes. Contention 2...
If the U.S. intervenes. So the argument is that they're going to attack Saudi Arabia for some reason. And if the U.S. intervenes, that would create conflict with miscalculation, which is typically miscalculation happens outside of conflict. Also, like, what miscalculation? Like, you're talking about, like, nukes going off on accident? Like, what are you talking about?
Is weapon system stability.
Okay, we're moving on. Fine.
Subpoint A is missile development. In the status quo, Treaty 18 of the National Interest finds that Iranian missile development is posing a major threat to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, forcing them to take action. But in order to deal with Iran's missiles, the Saudis have a choice. It can either insulate themselves from Iranian missiles and keep itself safe, or it can develop missiles of its own in order to deter Iran. Luckily, Saudi Arabia has chosen the defensive rather than the offensive option, focusing on missile defense development to defend against Iran, as Goshal 18 of the Balfour Strategic Defense Center finds that Saudi Arabia has turned towards strengthening their missile defense architecture, which currently has many holes, to ensure complete protection using U.S. missile defense systems.
So the argument is that you stop selling them U.S. missile defense systems, forcing them to go from defensive to offensive in this field, and that creates an arms race, and that leads to miscalculation. That makes a lot more sense than the first argument, but let's see where this goes.
Ending arms sales to Saudi Arabia forces them to pivot away from missile defense and towards offensive capabilities, making them fight fire with fire through their own missile program. Unfortunately, Saab 18 of Georgetown University finds that missiles are inherently destabilizing weapons because of their potential to quickly escalate conflicts, as their flight times can be very short and they are very lethal, citing that Saudi Arabian missile development will amplify conflict in the region. Subpoint B is nuclear.
So you don't... What drives me crazy sometimes is when people use evidence, they want to make a claim and it doesn't have evidence, so that this happens in extemp all the time. People will want to make a claim sound like it has evidence, so they will cite a part of the sentence, but not the part making the main claim. The main claim he just made is that Saudi Arabia developing their own missiles will create conflict, increase the chance of a conflict with Iran. The evidence that he read didn't directly say that, as far as I know. I'd like to see that evidence, but it sounded like he just read a generic card about the effect of missiles. Now, that's not to say you can't apply it there, but it's certainly not as strong as evidence that says, here is what would happen if we stopped selling them missile defense systems.
Saab 18 of Georgetown University finds that missiles are inherently destabilizing weapons because of their potential to quickly escalate conflicts, as their flight times can be very short and they are very lethal, citing that Saudi Arabian missile development will amplify conflict in the region.
Okay, so it says that it'll... Apparently it cites that it will. I'd like to see that evidence, but...
Subpoint B is nuclearization. Patent 18 of Newsweek indicates that Saudi Arabia is willing to build a nuclear arsenal in order to gain the ultimate edge on Iran. But Tamimi of George Washington University finds that insofar as they perceive U.S. commitment to protect them to be strong, they will never build such a weapon. However, Cavalry 18 of New York Times indicates that ending arms sales sends a strong signal to Saudi Arabia that the United States no longer supports them, forcing them to look towards a nuclear option. In fact, Sokolowski...
Let's listen to that again, sorry.
18 of New York Times indicates that ending arms sales sends a strong signal to Saudi Arabia that the United States no longer supports them, forcing them to look towards a nuclear option.
Okay, the other thing is, why are all of these pieces of evidence New York Times? Who wrote that article? What do they know about how Saudi Arabia would prioritize its defense strategy? Who was the author? Yeah, okay, so the argument is that by us not giving them defense systems, then they are going to create nukes. At this point, the negative has completely committed to defending the status quo. Probably going to lose them the debate. Because unless you can... The debate now becomes about whether the status quo is good or bad. Because one side's defending the status quo, and the other side has basically just come in and said the status quo is bad, and we try to do something different. So there's a debate about what would happen, but that clash is going to be almost impossible because both of them are talking about these completely imaginary, hypothetical scenarios without any real carded evidence saying, here's what would happen. So, at this point, it just becomes a question of whether, a stable Saudi Arabia being good is more important than 15 million starving people in Yemen is bad. I'm going to guess that the starving people of Yemen is going to win this debate, but let's find out.
In fact, Sokolowski 1804 policy finds that Saudi Arabia can enrich enough uranium to construct its first nuclear bomb within 1 year. However, rather than
These estimates are always, what are you talking about? Like, no one would intervene in that. Like, if Saudi Arabia can enrich enough uranium in 1 year to make nukes, why hasn't Iran built nukes? They like don't know how to enrich uranium, or they aren't getting enough uranium. Like, what's the difference? Why doesn't every country just decide to build nukes? It's probably harder than you're indicating there, and there's probably bigger barriers like the United Nations and the US and other places sanctioning you, which is probably bad for a place like Saudi Arabia, whose entire economy is built on the export of one commodity.
security. This will only bring about more chaos, as Kronig of Georgetown University finds that nuclear weapons increase instability while also making countries more confident and arrogant, increasing the chance of conflict. Moreover, Thayer 18 of Chicago finds that rapidly nuclearizing states.
Well, how? But that, see, this is the problem with generic evidence, right? Your evidence isn't talking about Saudi Arabia. How is Saudi Arabia going to be more confident and arrogant than having another person's military bomb civilians somewhere else for them with no consequences? What inhibitions does Saudi Arabia right now demonstrate, or what concerns for human rights do they right now demonstrate that you're imagining is going to be dropped once they now like have their own nukes, right? Like, you have to demonstrate that like A changes to B. Like, just generically say that things increase, so this thing will also increase. It doesn't have any uniqueness. You're skipping the uniqueness stage of a lot of these claims.
Often cut corners, making accidents and inadvertent detonations very likely. Which is why Trager 15 on net concludes that nuclear proliferation increases the chance of war by 950%. I'm good for cross.
Yeah, so I think the negative does a really weak job here demonstrating why the status quo is good. They've essentially just decided to defend the status quo by not offering any alternatives. Now, whether counter plans or blah, 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 sure. But what they've done here is that they've said that, like, they've committed to you make things worse. And at the point where the negative's entire strategy is to say you make things worse, their ability to win is hugely contingent on whether the status quo is perceived by the judge to be good or bad. Because that just becomes, it's a major strategic concept in debate, which I'm working on a video on. It's going to be good, hopefully. It's called Controlling the Uniqueness, but the point is that it's risk assessment. People make more of their decisions in risk assessment based on their perception of the status quo than they do about the evidence about the potential outcomes that you can have. In other words, if people think things are bad now, they're motivated to change. If people think things are good now, they're motivated to keep things the same. This negative team, while defending the status quo, gives us very little evidence of good things in the status quo right now. They say, like, right now they're mostly defensive, right? But that doesn't paint like any like thing that I'm like really hoping not to lose, right? You should tell me what's at stake. What good things could we lose? Otherwise, it just becomes a matter of, do I believe your evidence that things will get worse? And even if they will get worse, do I care compared to 15 million starving people? Let's find out. Cross X.
Really quickly before cross, can I see any card that says if they, like, if we end arms sales, Saudi Arabia will start building up, like, arms?
Excellent question, child.
We don't have a card that directly puts it on.
Yeah. So that's denying the antecedent. You're saying, like, they don't have their own arms development because they get it from the US. So if we get rid of the US, they'll make their own. Like, you need actual evidence that says that claim instead of saying this piece of paper says that they don't make their own because the US gives it to them, so the opposite must work. That's not how formal logic works. Hey, don't walk up with a phone and a piece of paper, kid. Alright, that's a little rude. Try to look like you're supposed to win the round. If a parent judge is sitting there watching this, they probably think that this is a dead heat right now, and they're looking for any reason to not be nervous and feel confident in the decision that they're going to make. They don't want to feel like they're about to be scrutinized by both teams, all their coaches, the school that hired them, the tournament directors. They don't want to get yelled at. The way you don't get yelled at is you make the correct decision. Most of these judges don't really understand that the only correct decision is what they thought was the better winning team. They try to adhere to this outside perception of who's supposed to win a debate, no matter how much tournament directors try to get them to not do that. So when one side's holding a laptop and the other one's holding a piece of lined paper, that creates the perception that probably the one wearing a suit with a laptop is the one that's supposed to win the debate. And what that also does is, if the person with a Chromebook and a suit, at least in the mind of the judge, they think if I make the person with the Chromebook and the suit and the whatever lose, I'll have to answer questions about that. But if I vote against the team that looks like they're probably supposed to lose, no one's going to ask me any questions. So if I don't want to get asked questions, I will probably vote for the more formal team, the team representing the qualities that I assume are supposed to indicate they're good at debate. So just don't give them excuses. Don't give them reasons. You have a MacBook, just bring it up. Don't look off a piece of paper. Don't use your phone as a timer. Go to Target, $5 kitchen timers.
Everyone good? Cool. So, at the bottom of your case, you talk about proliferation, right? You say, like...
Look, I'm doing this because I'm sweaty, but if you start a question like this, you don't look like you're about to come with a zinger that's about to win you the debate. And these things matter. Cross-examination is the time where the judges make the most direct comparison between the two debaters to try to determine who's supposed to win the debate. You have to assume they're not even listening to the words you say, and certainly even the flow judges aren't flowing. These don't count as arguments. You're just trying to set up arguments and create a perception that your opponents don't know what they're talking about. So you're not doing a good job of that right now.
Nuclear states increase the chance of war by like 950%. So like, what is an example of where like two states with nuclear weapons like went to war directly against each other?
The reason he's asking this question is because he's trying to stump his opponent by saying, well, I'm not saying that that's ever happened, but first of all, that doesn't apply because Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, as far as anyone knows. So you're not arguing that two states with nuclear weapons are going to go to war, right? This last argument that they're talking about was talking about nuclear proliferation in Saudi Arabia. So in nuclear Saudi Arabia, would it take action against Iran? I mean, probably not, but the barrier isn't the fact that they both have nukes. So that question already doesn't apply. Secondly, you're not taking into account the miscalculation, which is their like ace in the hole that they're going to try to use. So you're just setting him up to talk about what the case was built to talk about.
We're not talking about two states with nuclear weapons going to war with each other. We're talking about when one state has a nuclear weapon and other states don't, other states around it that is don't. That means the chance of war in that region increases by 950%.
So who will, like, if I buy this analysis, right? Sure. Who's attacking who?
So Saudi Arabia would be more likely to attack other countries as well. Probably other countries would be more likely to attack Saudi Arabia.
What countries?
So like we say, like specifically, it would probably look to like attacking Iran. And other
okay,
things.
but Iran also has nuclear weapons.
No, Iran doesn't have.
I mean, they have the capability. Like they've.
Okay, well, Saudi Arabia has the capability, and now you've just looked like you're losing the debate, right? Like now you look like you don't know what you're talking about. So in our cross-ex video, we're talking about like the point of cross-ex is to make your opponent look bad, and you've now essentially made yourself look bad by saying the sentence, Iran has nuclear weapons, and your opponent gets to say, no, they don't. Now you have to try to explain why. Well, they have the blah, blah, blah. They have the capability, and then that's not the same thing. You've made yourself successfully look bad.
Have the capability to build nuclear weapons, but I would argue that
yeah. So I would say like there's no reason why Saudi Arabia would attack Iran if they know Iran can make nuclear weapons.
Wait,
what? Okay, hopefully that. other side understands that the motivation would be, like, why would you... Okay. What the affirmative is failing to acknowledge, and hopefully every judge in the room recognizes, is that once you get nuked by another country, you don't then just move along like everything's fine and then build your nuke a year later and attack back, right? Like, probably your country has collapsed, fallen apart, and has signed a non-conditional surrender to whoever nuked you, like happened in Japan, right? Like, there was no, like, well, if we nuke Japan twice in a row, what will they do back to us? Like, that's not a valid concept with nuclear attacks on another country.
That doesn't make any sense. If Saudi Arabia has nuclear weapons in the first place, right, they would probably like feel free to attack Iran insofar as Iran doesn't have any nuclear weapons.
Yeah, but they know.
But second of all,
they're gonna
the
nuke
argument that we're going for isn't like purposeful war. The argument, as per the Thayer evidence at the bottom of the case, says that accidental detonations and launches are...
So, as far as impact framing and general debate strategy, I think both of them do a pretty weak job. If I had to try to save either side, if I had to just like sort of like tag in and take a side in the debate and try to save it, I probably would have decided the affirmative. But at this point, I mean, you can even just like look at the expression on their faces, right? Like, the person on the left looks like they just won a debate, and the person on the right looks like they just lost. And you could show this to anyone. Any child that has never done debate, and ask them which of these two is about to win the debate, and they will probably say that the person on the left is going to win the debate. And in theory, judges shouldn't be persuaded by that, but in practice, one, they are, and two, these things don't entirely happen at random. Probably the kid looks like he's losing because he is losing. So what that means is, even if you are losing terribly and you're in this position, you want to be very conscientious of your non-verbals and don't look like that, because you're inviting everyone to vote against you. And probably don't ask questions like that. But let's see. I might even just... I think what I'll probably do to keep this video from going on too long is skip to the end of the debate and listen to the RFDs, because it says it's in the video, and just see how accurately I predict the RFDs.
Very, very likely.
Okay.
But even if nuclear war doesn't happen, the Trager evidence at the bottom of the case says that nuclear weapons actually increase the probability of conventional war, not just nuclear war.
Okay.
But can I have a question?
Yeah, sure.
Great. Let's talk about your impact on specifically Yemen. So you tell me that there's like a massive famine in Yemen, right?
Yeah.
So really the only access the affirmative has to winning this debate at this round, or even picking up one of the 3 ballots, assuming there's 3 judges, is to win this Yemen impact, right? So that is where I would have gone with the question, and I wonder whether his question is going to be similar to what I pointed out. But if it is, then that's pretty much game. But let's see how this is handled.
What's causing this famine in Yemen?
Saudi-led airstrikes.
Oh, Saudi-led airstrikes. Why are airstrikes causing this famine?
I mean, that's the exact Monday evidence we read.
No, but like, what is the warranting for that evidence?
Like, Saudi Arabia bombs like food production facilities in Yemen.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, they had a block to that basically says that even if you stop the airstrikes, the food production is not going to pick back up. So you probably shouldn't have made the only impact you have in this debate Yemen. Let's see what happens in the rest of this cross.
I mean, that's like what our case is about.
All right.
Yeah. So then really quickly on your case about like geopolitics, right? You say, so essentially like all of your case, right?
Yep.
Is built off this premise that the United States will not be allies with Saudi Arabia, right?
The perception of that the United States is no longer...
With the perception?
Yeah.
How does that make any sense?
So like...
How does that make any sense? When you stop giving arms to someone and break an agreement you have, saying you want to stay friends often does not motivate them. When you break the premise for an alliance, that tends to hurt the alliance. These questions aren't doing any of the things that we talk about in the cross-ex video, right? They're not setting up for an argument. They're just asking, aren't you wrong? And so the other side's going to come up and say, no, we're not wrong. Well, what is the goal of this question? Is this question being asked with a specific answer in mind? Because if he's imagining they're going to say, wait, whoa, you're right, like, I guess that doesn't end the alliance, then that's never going to happen. I think what they're going to try to do, or at least he's going to try to do in the third speech, is come up and say, I asked my opponent in cross-ex whether this would end the alliance, and they didn't say that it would. But it's not going to take a lot of nuance to explain how, yeah, this is going to create the perception. It's going to hurt U.S.-Saudi relations. Stopping trade hurts relations.
If you're specifically talking about the first contention, right? The subpoint A says, like, if other countries perceive the United States no longer as strong allies with Saudi Arabia, they're more likely to rush into the Middle East.
Okay, so
but the second, okay, sure. Yeah.
So what is the like bright line for this perception, right? Because I would say I would say if,
cutting off arms
if the U.S. always has Iran's back, or not Iran, sorry, Saudi Arabia's back, other countries know if they try to attack Saudi Arabia, the U.S. will defend them.
The evidence is really explicit. If the United States cuts off arms sales, that signals to the world.
Look, yeah, that's fine. He's trying to like short circuit the like internal link impact story on contention 1, which is fine. Yeah, probably people are not going to attack Saudi Arabia. But the argument that he's way behind on now is Saudi Arabia attacking others. Like, doesn't that supercharge that argument? I fucking hate the term supercharge. But doesn't that only make the contention 3 stronger? Because what you've now set up is that no one will attack Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is more likely to attack others. In other words, Saudi Arabia can develop its own nukes unchecked by any country, including the United States, but no one will attack or try to impede in the process because they will have the perception that the U.S. will stop them. And if the negative kid is clever, he'll just say, yeah, sure, sounds good, and then just accept that and go all in on contention 3 and collapse to that. More likely, he's going to try to create some sort of confusing answer that allows him to keep all of his arguments, whereas he only needs to win one argument that is good, and if you set up what I was just talking about, you'd have a winning contention 3. Let's see how he handles it.
That the United States is no longer defending the alliance. But can I have a question?
No, wait. That signals like that we're like punishing them, right?
No,
but it doesn't. It doesn't like, send a signal that we're never going to defend them.
Can I have a question before process? Yeah, sure. All right. Let's talk about the second warrant on your first on your only contention, right? So you tell me that there's like going to be like this congressional precedent, right? Yeah. So what's the time frame on us cutting off arms sales to all other nations that are like committing human rights abuses?
No. So essentially, the argument, right, is we cut off to Saudi Arabia. That's like the biggest example of arms sales that violate human rights.
Okay.
So that means in the future, Congress.
So like which countries? What is the specific impact?
I mean, like there's lots of countries we sell to. Like,
there's no impacts, right? The only impact you read, because you had 3 separate contentions and should have been 3 separate contentions and had 3 separate impacts, is you should have talked about some other area where the U.S. is selling arms and explained some sort of internal link scenario for how we also eventually stop selling arms there. You didn't do that. And so this kid's trying to ask, like, well, what's the impact that you're, like, whatever, and the fact of the matter is that there is none. So it sounds like the kid on the affirmative is winning the question, but the fact is that he's just admitting that his argument was never as good as the negative was worried it would be.
Okay, right.
Okay.
In the second,
my prediction is that the negative is going to win on the argument that without the United States giving him military aid, Saudi Arabia turns its military operations that are defensive to be more offensive, and it will also be more aggressive against Iran, which is going to give them 2 paths of either intentionally or unintentionally creating military conflict. Now, the affirmative second speaker could have great blocks to miscalculation and nuclear proliferation. at this stage, I don't know that I would assume that they would have a bad case but great blocks. I think they're going to try at the end to talk about the 60,000 people who were killed in Yemen so far, and the 15 million people who are at risk of starvation, but they're going to have a really hard time answering the fact that they don't have a mechanism for stopping Saudi Arabia wanting to do that, or addressing the fact that no country is trying to stop Saudi Arabia. The U.S. could stop helping, but as long as the negative could prove that Saudi Arabia could get close to doing that without America's help, or that the damage is already done, there's going to be very little chance for them to outweigh the increased tensions and nuclear whatever. So my guess right now is that the RFDs are going to be along those lines, and that it's going to be a 3-0 for the affirmative. It's a little warm. I'm a little bored. Let's skip to the RFDs and find out. Great.
So, in a 2-1 decision...
2-1. So, okay. Let's see where this goes.
The con wins the round. So, I guess since I'm announcing, I'll start by sort of...
Whoa, you start with the squirrel. Come on. You don't start with who's announcing.
Walking through my reason for decision. So, for me, this round basically came down to sort of weighing the impacts of immediately ending the war in Yemen versus through like grounding airstrikes versus like the broader impacts of potentially destabilizing the Middle East. The only offense that I sort of had coming off of the pro side of the flow.
First of all, which side did you vote for? Start with that.
That was like pulled through the round and consistently extended is that Saudi Arabia won't have the weapons to sufficiently continue to like carry out attacks in Yemen. And while I would have liked to see more evidence supporting Saudi Arabia's...
These also aren't parent judges, so some of the perception stuff probably doesn't affect it as much, but certainly doesn't only affect parent judges, right? Like looking like you're losing is not a lay judge only thing. It affects every judge.
Ground capabilities when you guys were like making that analytic about like sort of the ability of Saudi Arabia to continue the war in Yemen like with ground arms. I can also reasonably buy that Saudi Arabia could get offensive ground weapons from other countries to continue the war. I think that's like a completely reasonable analytic that I can buy. Meanwhile, on the con side of the flow, I have arguments standing about like the perception of Saudi Arabia's military strength. I can buy that like an alliance still exists when the pro sort of talks about like, oh, well, we still have all these other facets of the alliance. But if there's perception that Saudi Arabia's power is weakened, which is like talked about like in the Darwin's card, then there's potential for miscalculation and like further escalation of tensions in like the broader Middle East. And while I think that like this impact is kind of nebulous and could be better quantified,
which is to say that they read no defense against miscalc and nuclear proliferation.
When you tell me that it outweighs like all these Yemen impacts on the pro side of the flow because destabilizing the multiple countries in the Middle East and like the potential for like a miscalculation and the potential for like offense like between like the US and Iran is like just outweighs like things going wrong like in.
So another problem that I'm sure this is indicative of is that I don't think that the last couple speeches on each side were very clear. A judge's RFD should start with what the debater told them to vote on and why they did or did not do that. When a judge is just talking about every argument in the debate and being like, well, here's what I thought of this and I'm trying to compare it to that, that means that two important things didn't happen. Neither side really collapsed to an issue and gave the judge a single issue to consider and vote on, which is critically important because that's how you end up with 2-1s. The negative should have won this 3-0, but by not collapsing to a single issue and telling the judge, look, all that matters is whether you buy this sentence. If you believe this, then you vote for us. And if you don't, go ahead and vote for them. But here's why you should believe it. It confronts the judge and makes them have to examine that question. They can't like pick a random other part of the flow to vote on. The other thing that didn't happen is probably more direct impact comparisons, because it sounds like this guy's saying like, I am trying to do blah, blah, blah. And again, the impacts were nebulous. And I'm shocked as to how little of this debaters hear and take into consideration, because every RFD I hear seems to be saying your impacts suck, and no one ever thinks, how do I improve my impact, apparently. Let's move on.
One particular country on magnitude. And since I didn't really get that same level of like weighing the impacts, like in terms of like magnitude or on probability in the final focus, and I do get that level of like impact analysis from the con, I ended up just voting con because I believe that like on impacts, con outweighs.
Don't ask questions. When the judge says that, you say thank you or you shut the fuck up. But you asking a question is not appropriate right now. Right? Being like, so the only question is like, so would you have been persuaded by this? It's just so annoying, because odds are you didn't really understand what they were saying. Or the worst one is like, so did you catch where I said this? Where it's like, yeah, dude, I did. I mean, I don't know, maybe these are inexperienced judges, but I highly doubt it. So let's hear this question. I thought it was a kid saying so, because what that made me think was like a kid was about to like ask a question, which I think is less common in probably high school, because there's this perception of like adults versus children. But in college, you get that, especially in like higher up in the circuit, which like you're not going to change the vote. You're just going to guarantee that that judge now never wants to vote for you again.
On impacts, con outweighs.
I also voted con, and I think what really got me was, so your national interest card.
So I want you to, I'm going to go back and I want you to look at the body language of the person who voted affirmative, who I'm imagining is the gentleman with the glasses. And he's sitting there looking like, yikes, how am I going to explain why I voted that way? And sometimes the squirrel has a very good reason. It's like, hey, here's why I think because usually the squirrel goes first. Here's why I think the other judges voted the way they did. I think that's perfectly valid. Here's why I didn't do that. And they explain that. But in this case, it seems like he's going to try to make an excuse for why he voted the way he did, keep his RFD kind of short, and just get out of there, because he does not like that he feels like he made the incorrect choice. And it looks like he doesn't really have good answers to why the other judges shouldn't have voted the way they did. So like
on probability in the final focus,
kind of that 1,000-yard stare, kind of like looking off.
I ended up just voting con because I believe that like on impacts, con outweighs.
Okay.
I also voted con, and I think what really got me was, so your national interest card, pro, in your rebuttal, you guys talked about like, this isn't specific, it's just a power vacuum, and I actually bought that, but if you would have extended that throughout your summary and your final focus, that would have done it for me, honestly. For con, I didn't really, the Hannigan evidence about like the fundamental contract, I actually like went with pro on that point. I just thought that like their logic that they already have an alliance, I just kind of went with that. But
what? I mean, I guess I didn't watch the round, right? But all of this is to say that it's not these judges' faults. The judge is never wrong. If the judge is having a difficult time making a decision, like, it's your job to convince them. It's your job to understand where they're coming from, where their experience level is, what decisions they can feel confident in making, and then present them with one of those decisions. It sounds like the con didn't do that. You probably didn't collapse to one of your three contentions, and you probably did not narrow the debate down to one question the judge should ask themselves. And in order to do that, you need to be able to identify what one impact is the most important in the round which you think you can confidently get access to. Once you have that, which you should have had by cross-ex after the first set of speeches, you should just focus on that and make the judges be like, I bought this argument on this part of the flow. That's it. But now they're sort of just like a little convinced by this and not convinced by that and jumping around. Like, there's no reason why a judge should be talking about negative arguments they didn't buy in their RFD, because there's no reason the negative should have extended those arguments into the final focus.
I think Khan really took it away when you guys talked about the narrative that Pro was creating with the Houthis, and you just said that all, like, the famine and all that they're talking about is concentrated in the areas that the Houthis are controlling, and so they're the ones that are stealing food, etc., etc. And so I think that's what really took it away from you.
They read some sort of block that said that the famine is going to continue, or at least a perception of it is that it's blah blah blah, or it's not based on whatever. They had a famine block, which is all it took for them to win the debate, because that's the only impact the other side read. That's what I was talking about. When you have one impact, right, that has any significant weight, all you're asking is for the other side to come up and read one card and then you lose. Don't do that. Be strategic in the arguments you run.
So I squirreled in this round. I guess the reason why I voted for the app was like off of this argument about like capabilities. So I guess like I didn't really know how to feel about this argument that like if you took away some of their capabilities or some of Saudi Arabia's capabilities, they would like send a full-in like ground invasion. I looked at like the Starlight card and it said that Saudi Arabia would still intervene, but I didn't really know what like intervening necessarily means. I guess like what I interpreted the app's argument to be was that like these precision airstrikes were the ways in which they were destroying the food facilities. I guess it wasn't necessarily the case that if they like sent some ground troops in, the same thing would happen. So I guess then like that was just how I interpreted it. It seemed like it was something.
Which probably means that your case should have been better written, and that this judge is doing a little bit of work for the affirmative, which isn't, bad necessarily, but yeah, it sort of like it takes work to vote for the affirmative. The people voting neg didn't say, well, here's what I interpreted the neg to mean, and I'm not sure if that's what they meant, but here's how I blah blah blah. So
something that was unique to the weapons that they were getting, and I guess that's when like I bought the link into their impacts of like the UN part with like the 12 or 13 million lives. I just gave that to them. I don't really know how to feel about like.
And the 12 or 13 million lives should have been outweighed by nukes, right? Like, but you didn't read that. You didn't read any evidence, any impacts to miscalculation. You just said miscalculation could happen. Way more than 15 million people would die if a nuclear attack or miscalculation happened in the Middle East. They just would, but because you never read that, you lost the judge.
This like the Hannigan evidence, I had like the same opinion over there that like the alliance would still last, but I didn't really think that was too important. On to like this national interest argument.
The alliance would still last, right? So you should have accepted that alliance would still last argument and then use that for your contention 3 of Saudi Arabia, now with its own nukes and the US defending it, would attack Iran. But by attempting to go for all your arguments at the same time, you lost the opportunity to use that. You were going to lose that argument anyway, right? Like, or maybe you weren't, but it was more useful to you. I mean, you lost it twice, so it sounds like you were going to lose it anyway. But you could have used that, conceded it, turned it, used it for one of your other contentions. And that takes a lot of experience. But the way you do it is you're always keeping in mind, like, what is my win condition in this debate? What is the one argument I'm going to go for? What's looking the strongest, right? If you're trying to cover all your bases at the same time, you miss these opportunities. But if you're saying all I need is one argument, how can I use each thing? Do I need this argument? Do I need to defend it? Can I concede this? Is there a way I can use this? I can turn this, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it didn't take me very much time to figure out that strategy. It's not like something that I spent I'm not even flowing the debate, right? But you have to keep in mind, like, what is your winning argument in this debate? And everything should be framed around making that work.
Like, I guess like you guys seem to suggest that like if Saudi Arabia continued, they would completely like wipe out the Houthi, I guess, of sorts, and like end the war.
All of this uncertainty from this person, from all of the judges, is because these people don't have impacts. They don't clarify what they think will happen. You need to do that, or you're gonna get a lot of 2-1 decisions and coin flip type results, and then you're gonna be like, well, why didn't I break at this tournament? I broke at this tournament. These judges suck. Blah blah blah. Oh, the other side was really good with their analytics. PF is just about how you dress. Not to say those aren't all true complaints, but you have to make it so that judges don't have excuses, that there's nothing they can hide behind. Now, when it's this vague, when you don't have any clear analytics on the outcome you're saying is going to happen, right? The story you're telling doesn't have a clear ending, then you're inviting the judge to vote however they want and not based on whether they believe that specific story. And when you put them in a position where they're not sure what the story they're voting on is, they start making decisions on random things, and you don't want them to do that. You want to have a clear story, focus on one aspect of it, and say the only question is whether you believe this or not. And a lot of people would think that judging debates gets harder the better the teams are, or that wow, those two teams were really good, so that means that on a 7-person panel it's got to be like a 4-3. But the fact of the matter is that it's more, with better teams, I think it's more stratifying. It's either all or nothing, right? Like, it's rarer that there's several ways of winning or losing the round, and you just sort of like, it's a matter of luck. Like, if you ran the round back 10 different times with 10 different panels, you would have like won or lost different amounts. The better the debaters are, even if the losing team is good, right? The debates with good debaters tend to come down to fewer issues for the judges to consider at the end, and they should be asked to consider it in objective ways based on the evidence. So in theory, the debate should just be won or lost at the end, regardless of who's judging. It's never quite perfectly that way, and it's important to accept that and strategize around it, but these teams should be, even the winning team, should be looking at the way these judges are giving feedback, the lack of confidence with which they're doing it, the lack of unity on what they're voting on or what they're not voting on, or what they buy or they don't buy, as a major area of concern that they should be focusing their practice efforts on.
So like, I guess like the vibe I was getting around was that like when I looked at the evidence, all they were doing was like winning a few battles. I wasn't really sure how to weigh that in the sense where it was like, oh, you win some battles and you liberate some areas, but in the affirmative world, like, you end these airstrikes that are kind of like probably affecting more of the country, if that makes sense. So I guess like,
and what I imagine a lot of these debaters are going to walk away thinking is like, how do I find cards that blah, blah, blah? But the cards weren't the issue here. The issue was the impact framing that came out of there. The way the impacts were written, the way the impacts were carried across. Impacts are the most important thing in debate. The most important part of your arguments. The most important thing in debate is the commodity of time. But the most important part of your case is the impacts. And especially in public forum, people are just really, 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 really bad at writing impacts.
Like, once, I feel like they extended, like, there were 12 to 13 million lives, and that was, like, pretty clear to me. And then I didn't really know how to, like, weigh the Houthi part of things, so then I just took
We didn't make this analysis, like, in round, but, like, would you buy an analysis?
So we did do the thing that I thought would be really fucking annoying, but, okay, what's the question?
That was like the reason Houthi controlled areas are worse off is because like Saudi Arabia airstrikes on like food production in those areas, and that's the reason why they're worse off.
No, I didn't even hear that argument, and no, I wouldn't buy that argument because it seems to me like the other side read evidence that said that the perception is that the Houthis are at fault. Doesn't matter if they're not actually at fault. The point is that the mechanism that you're talking about that ends the famine or fixes the problem doesn't work.
Like, would that analysis make sense if we...
That sounds reasonable to me.
Yeah, but their evidence also says like the Houthis have like pretty poor mismanagement and they're like seizing this. So like I don't think that would have taken away from what they were saying.
Right, because the evidence does also talk about like
So this guy just sounds good to me and then immediately changes his mind.
specific problems like with like the regime like in places like where that regime's in control. So
Yeah, I think they still would have even if you about that.
Now for like a really weak, like, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, well, hopefully that was going to this portal. I can make this bigger now. Whoa, too big. Whatever. Hopefully that was useful and interesting. I'd love to know what rounds you want me to look at and do that with. Or if you thought that this was useful at all. It was useful to me because it gave me topic ideas. This is how I get a lot of the topic ideas. I watch rounds and I think, what are the problems I'm seeing? And then I'll make little videos about it. But if there's other rounds specifically you want me to watch, it doesn't have to be public forum. In fact, please God help me. Don't let it be public forum. It's fine if it's public forum. LD, policy, parley, whatever. Happy to weigh in and help, and hope that was useful and interesting.